everyone, and welcome. Excited to get to talk. I feel like, as EY just hinted at, we'll get more into a lot of the meat of the main discussion here, but I think it'd be interesting to start off some of the most, I think, recent developments. I know you spoke earlier today a bit more broadly about what's going on in Iran, but given our focus on particularly sort of like the internal dynamics of the Jewish community, and I'm interested in your thoughts on the Jewish community's response, especially the American Jewish community's response to what's been happening in Iran, and on a different topic, thoughts on both our exciting win last night and also the pretty vehement response that has been getting amongst the established American Jewish community.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's really amazing to be here. I mean, I just want to first say something about the Halakhic Left, which is an organization that I actually speak about a lot, and I talk about it a lot when people ask me where they can find their people. And I've recently been traveling. I was in Melbourne, Australia. I was in Little Rock, Arkansas. I was in London, and you could, as you could imagine, there are a lot of people there who feel very, very isolated. It's like in Australia, I found, especially in Melbourne, more than Sydney, people don't say, "I have my political views cause problems with my family." They say, "My family doesn't speak to me, nor does anyone I went to school with." It's like I think American Jews tend to think about ourselves as like, "Oh, woe is us, so hard to be a lefty Jew in the United States." Like, believe me, go to Melbourne, right? Or Montreal, or Little Rock. But there's just this tremendous, in every place, there's this hunger. And I think the way it relates to the Zoran thing, then I'll talk about the Iran thing, is I think that the first line of public statement about someone like Zoran Mamdani from the American Jewish establishment is, Jews are not safe, Jews fear him, Jews hate him. If you care about Jews, do everything you can to destroy him. And then when someone annoying like me or many other people like you inject some data point which suggests, well, actually, it looks, as far as we can tell, like he may not have won a plurality of the Jewish vote in New York, but he did quite well. I haven't really seen data post-election, I don't know if any of you have, but there was a forward poll which showed him in second place behind Cuomo. I think Cuomo had 31, he had 20. And my guess would be, if you broke it down by generation, that Mamdani might win among younger American Jews. If you say that, then their response is, we have a group of people who claim to be Jews, but are not actually Jews in a meaningful sense. They don't care about being Jewish. They don't care about other Jews. They've, in some fundamental way, kind of broken the covenant. People look for, I find people very unoriginal with this couple thing. We have a rich tradition of insults that I feel like people could deploy, but it seems like people are so, anyway, or if they think they're really, they're really sophisticated, they'll say, they're like the Sevsyekstia in the Soviet Union is actually sophisticated. I don't know, whatever it is, But basically they're un-Jews, to use Natan Sharansky's phrase, right? And the Halakhic Left is one of many refutations of that, actually, and I think there's such a bubble that I find that so many people are encased in their WhatsApp groups and their little whatever, that and it would be disorienting and painful for them. It's disorienting and painful enough to recognize that there are many, many, many young Jews, maybe not a majority of young Jews, but probably a very, very large minority, if not majority, who have very serious questions, not just about Netanyahu and about Gaza, but about the whole enterprise, right? And depending on how you ask the question, you can elicit that. If it wasn't just the Jewish organizations who were sponsoring all the polling, we would actually get a lot more of this distant information, because when you ask questions that are not just straight down, you get all kinds of stuff that really. But it's even more painful and disorienting to realize those people actually do care about being Jewish, and in some ways are leading a kind of a Jewish religious revival, and that's what has struck me, when I was on campuses again and again, and I think makes this generation of Jewish left different than previous generations. I don't think that, as the people who went to Freedom Summer, Mississippi were heroic, but I don't think they were doing Havdalah at SNCC meetings. I know the South Africans the South African Jews in the ANC who were very well represented were communists who were not interested in Judaism and had negative associations with it. And I think it's your generation. Obviously, you're not all young, but your generation is unusual partly in how I think much you are interested in Judaism and making it meaningful. And I think that's even more threatening in some ways for this establishment, which is so thin. I mean, because in some ways, often its Judaism is so thin itself, that in some ways, I feel like the rebellion is not only against the immorality of the establishment, but about the thinness of the Judaism. I mean, there's I will not mention his name, a very prominent Jewish editor who happens to send his kids to the same school as my kids went to, who basically said that Zoram Damdani represents a fundamental rejection of the principles at the core of Judaism. And my thought is like, this is a statement by someone who hasn't thought a lot about it, but seems to just think it needs ethno-nationalism or something like that. So that's on Iran. I mean, I guess I would say it's a version of the same thing. It's just kind of like, you have a discourse about Iran. And obviously Iran is an ugly, virally nasty regime. I would love to see its leaders be overthrown and have a more free regime in Iran. But like, there's a discourse about Iran, which is basically like Iran is this version, this generation's Nazis or whatever. And it's like, it bears no relation to the way that Iran is actually behaving. I mean, if you just look at how Iran is behaving, it's desperately trying to stay out of a war with Israel. It's like almost comical how much it's practically appeasing Israel. Israel attacks. The Iranians attack and say, oh, fuck, we gotta fight back. But we're so much weaker. So let's do this. I've got an idea. We're gonna launch some missiles, but we're telling them we're gonna launch them ahead of time to make sure they don't hit anything in the hopes that they won't actually then continue the war. Although then they do, right? Because actually the irony is like, the illustration that appeasement doesn't work is Iran, right? Because they're desperately trying to appease Israel and it's not working. So anyway, to me, these are both examples of just kind of how we have a communal discourse. And unfortunately, there are a lot of politicians who tend to buy into this discourse. Some of them become like extremely literate in our parochial discourse, and there's certain politicians, including one north of here, who represents part of the state of North Korea. I often marvel at how well he has mastered this discourse. I'm like, wow, did this guy go to Ramah? He speaks this discourse with such extraordinary fluency. I'm like, how could it not be his native language? But so you export this insularity and basically it leads to policies that are very, very bad for the United States, and I think bad for the Jews of Israel too. Sorry, that was long.
No, the answer is not a very short question. Yeah, I think that also that portrayal of Iran touches on one of the main points in your book, which is obviously the narratives around like strength and victimhood, and the fact that like in this situation, Israel is so patently the stronger, the stronger agent, and yet Iran is the Nazi regime of those two things. Like that is the way it's portrayed.
Yes.
When it's patently less powerful. So more broadly to our topic here, you started writing your book pretty shortly after October 7th, which unfortunately is like over 1.5 years ago now. And interested, just for folks who haven't already heard this, I imagine some folks have already heard you speak before on this topic, but a little bit about what prompted you to start writing it, and then also about some of what's changed in the community since you began writing it.
And forgive me if you have heard something. It's one of the things about being on like a book tour is you feel like politicians saying the same lines again and again. Sometimes I want to contradict myself just to keep it, fresh. But then I realize like it wouldn't make sense. I think the thing that kind of kept hitting me after October 7th was, and then Israel's assault on Gaza, was the way in which the communities that I am part of were essentially blocking out things that seemed to me right in front of our eyes, which was Palestinian death, Palestinian suffering. It was kind of like generally not acknowledged at all. And if you'd come into a Jewish institution and basically like there hadn't been a discussion of what was happening, that might have been one thing, right? So okay, we're here to daven or whatever, right? But in fact, as you will know, there was an intense focus on the suffering of Israelis on October 7th and hostages. And I often found that very beautiful and very powerful. But in some ways, found myself in with this struggling, because the more powerful it was, the more deeply humanized Israeli suffering and Israeli humanity was, the more astonishing it was that there was so little effort, if any effort at all, to humanize Palestinians at all. And it seemed to me kind of like, what was the, if usually there was no mention, if there was then if there was an acknowledgement, it was often framed in some form of, it's unfortunate, but they're basically killing themselves, if we can even count, or maybe some of them are dying, but probably not nearly as many as we're being told, or even if it was better than that, I'd never heard a single name of a person who was killed, or anything, anything about the humanity of this person. And I think, what is the Judaism that's on offer here? Because many of you may have thought more deeply about this. I've always been really intrigued by the way in which Judaism is trying to balance and navigate the tension of, special obligations that we have to other Jews, to one another, and a universal moral commitment. And I think that I don't think that's a simple, to figure out, and I don't necessarily say that everyone's going to come down in the same place as I am, and I think it would probably be hard to make a purely universalistic case in which basically we don't have any special obligations to one another. But I didn't see a wrestling with that tension at all. To me, it was essentially like a purely tribal kind of creed being offered, basically. Like maximum concern for people who are Jews, basically zero concern for Palestinians, And that struck me as just kind of some form of Jewish life and Judaism that struck me as like a really, really, really dangerous form of nationalism. And I was trying to understand, became interested in the stories that people around me were telling themselves that kind of allowed them to kind of be in what seemed to me this position of just not seeing what was in front of them, And so that was, I think, the genesis of the book.
Yeah, and what do you think, obviously, the book is also titled about, after the destruction of Gaza, and we're still in it, so long after.
Right.
And do you feel like there are, things, even just meaningful developments that you've observed since finishing writing the book, or things that you were even noticing in the process that felt like shifts, either obviously not necessarily shifts in a good direction, but
right.
shifts in general?
I kind of feel like there are more people who have come to the conclusion that maybe that this assault on Gaza should stop. And so, I'm glad about that, and they've been influenced by the sense that in Israel there are a lot of people who, mostly because of the hostages, basically want to get the hostages back and stop, at least temporarily. But what I don't see much of is a kind of reckoning with what the justification was in the first place, right? And it seems to me it has a resonance of kind of America in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's like we're tired of this now. Let's just call it an end, or let's focus our attention on something else, which is, now we're getting to fight Iran and Hezbollah, and that we feel clear about. That's the war that we now makes sense to us anymore. So there's not a kind of much of a moral reckoning with what's actually been done, and the fact that, and I almost sometimes feel like people are kind of I hear people kind of say versions of things like, well, surely one needed to support this attack on Gaza at the beginning, but at a certain point, and I was like, but wait a second, the war, they're not destroyed Hamas, it has not gotten the hostages back. So you're saying that, so the people who were against it from the beginning have been, I think, proven correct. In fact, now we have this insane situation in which Israel, because it's trying to find alternatives to Hamas, which is still there, it now seems to be aiding and arming clans that have ties to Al-Qaeda, right? I mean, it's just almost a parody of this idea that basically, you think that you're going to destroy Hamas, even if you could destroy Hamas, and then what? You're going to get, I don't know, you're going to get, Mahatma Gandhi. I don't know if you're going to get like Salam Fayyad. Like, who do you think is going to come out of this? Like, basically, you have just, when everybody has basically seen their family members murdered and starved to death, like, you're going to get moderates? Like, you're going to de-radicalize Gaza this way? There seems to be, again, such an unwillingness and inability to just think in very simple terms about Palestinians as human beings and how they might respond as human beings to what you do. And this way in which mainstream establishment Jewish discourse speaks about Palestinians as if Palestinians are a static object of basically eternal Jew haters, who just have somehow managed to reincarnate the Jew haters of old from secular history and sacred texts, without thinking at all about how they behave. And this is also true in the United States, right? So it's like, oh my gosh, like, people really, really don't like Israel. And it's, in America now. And it's changed. It used to be when I went to Columbia or Penn, I could be in the pro-choice environmental group, and I could be a proud Zionist, and it was great, and everything was fine. And now people give my kids a really hard time, like, there's an eruption of anti-Semitism that has just come out of the woodwork because I guess like it's one of those like Shabbat timer clocks, like it just goes off, at a certain point in history for no particular reason, right? Without thinking at all about like cause and effect. Again, that doesn't mean I would justify, of course, everything that's done. There is genuine anti-Semitism. There's also something which is not anti-Semitism, but it's just called being an asshole, right? Like you don't need to be an asshole to someone who's just come out of a gap year in Israel and has or is a Jew for families Iran or Russia has a very different understanding of Israel. You can actually, Mamdani is a good example of how to do this. Like Mamdani talks to people and he says you don't have to agree with me on everything, and I think that's much better. But like again, it's this unwillingness to recognize any cause and effect. Which then just, Mamdani's elected. Well, again, it's because somehow like the kind of zombies came and basically turned all of half of New York City into anti-Semites, including a significant number of the Jews. Like, how did that happen? Well, it's just because that's the way things are.
Yeah, I think the question of people who have like started to shift their stance in the war is an interesting one from also the sort of strategic standpoint, which is this question, like, again, the people who have been big figures, like, who wasted so much breath advocating for the war, right, especially as, like, the, like, liberal advocates for the war in the first year or so, who've, like, started to either quiet down or, like, tentatively express their disapproval. And as you said, like, basically almost never with, like, an al-khayt of, like, I was wrong, like, this, but just being, like, as you said, like, initially it was right, maybe it started to be no longer good. And I mean, personally, I feel like this deep frustration at like the absolute lack of tshuva and like, again, people who have done so much harm with their words. And there's like on the one side, like a friend once described it this way, and it's frankly I think an apt analogy of the people just like a misbehaving dog wanting to like rub their nose in the shit, of being like, this is what you did. Right? And at the same time, strategically it's like, it's good to have more people decide that this is bad, right? Like objectively we want more people to come to the conclusion that it shouldn't happen, right? And so like how do we balance the fact, that like if we don't reckon with the reasons people supported this in the first place, we ultimately replicate harm, and also we want people to come to this conclusion.
I mean, I think it's important, I say this as someone who is myself in a lot of ways late to coming to understand these things, in the sense that, I was probably older than a lot of people in this room when I started to rethink some kind of fundamental questions about Israel. And I think, I try to remind, I think it's good to recognize that none of us come from a position of, or very few of us come from a position of having always been right about everything and being ahead of the game, and many of us sooner or later have something to apologize for, and the older you get, the more it turns out you've been wrong about often and you have to apologize for it, because younger people come along and say, what, you thought this? I was like, well, a lot of people of my age thought this. And it's like, well, that's no excuse, So I think it is good to be generous in that way, but on the other hand, I think that generosity, you want to try in a kind and generous and loving way to encourage people to think more, right? To go further and to engage more, you know, and also that it is, and maybe not to kind of kick the people to their left who saw things earlier than them, right? Even if they don't want to, you know, I'm not expecting, yeah, I mean, I'm not expecting people to celebrate those people, but you don't have to actually basically insult them as you basically come to recognize things that they were saying, you know, a year and a half ago, and I think the question is, for me, I think about how to do that, and I think to me it's mostly about encouraging people to just engage with people and texts and experiences that they may not have, and not to tell them what they're going to find, but just to say, like, you know, what, you know, how much time have you spent with Palestinians? That's kind of like, how much time have you spent with Palestinians? How much have you read or listened to? How much time have you spent listening to Palestinians? That's something I tend to say to people, and because I find this frustrating experience of being constantly told that I'm naive about Palestinians. Like you are so naive. I'm like, it may well be that I am naive, but what's the basis of your experience and your deep understanding of Palestinians that has led you to think that I'm naive? And then we'll say, well, okay, yeah, you may have talked to a bunch of Palestinians, but you know, the Palestinians you're talking to are not representative. I'm like, well, maybe not, but they're at least Palestinians. I mean, you're not talking to anybody, right? Like, there's zero, like, very, very frequently, you know? And I think that if people can be nudged along that, then they have an experience which is, you know, again, will be familiar to many people, which is, first of all, I think they realize that even if they thought things for Palestinians weren't great, it turns out that they're a lot worse than they thought, because they were often thinking in abstractions, kind of, and often with the sense of, yeah, things are bad, but they brought it on themselves, and they're not like, they're bad, but they're not like really, really bad, like the things that Russia does, and the things that like Iran does, and the things that China does. And actually I said, well, actually, you know, they actually may well be. And then also then there's this experience that these people who you're whose books you're writing, or whose films you're watching, or who you're talking to, or whatever, are fully human. You know, in a way that you might not be. You may not realize you don't see them as fully human. But I think that's part of the power of the encounter, is that when you encounter them, you realize that you didn't see them as fully human. It's like, oh my gosh, that person has a piano in their apartment. You know, like that you know, it's like these very basic things, which I think are not, you know, I think it's similar for white people encountering black people, or any group that's accustomed to dehumanizing supremacy. You don't even realize how much this is baked into you until you actually encounter that humanity, and then it forces you, and maybe you start to feel a certain sense of like, of even shame about the very profound racism, which is just so pervasive in not just in Jewish spaces, but in mainstream American spaces, that it's like water that we swim in and we don't even acknowledge. Like we have no discourse of we have almost no discourse of anti-Palestinian bigotry, because if we had a discourse of anti-Palestinian bigotry, such a vast percentage of the people in public life would be guilty of it, right? That in some ways it can't even exist really as a concept.
I think also the notion of, again, the encounter is something that can fundamentally alter people's empathy. In my experience, I think there's also a difference between encountering people on their own terms versus in like dual narrative tours, for example. Like I feel like I know a decent number of folks who have ended up in a very different political place than a lot of folks here who still support the assault in Gaza, who are like self-identified liberals who've like gone on a tour, right? You do like a dual narrative tour where you like speak with a Palestinian who explains how like their life is bad, and then you speak to a settler who's like, well, like we love peace, and like, you know, we just love the land, and like, you know, and so like immediately the Palestinian narrative is like sanitized by like a framework in which it exists. So I think it's also like both fundamentally true that actual deep human connection can make a real shift, and the actual fact of just having spoken to someone, period, is not always gonna.
Yes, you're right, and there's also the question of people, even if people have certain dissident thoughts, they have to be willing to do something about it, right? And so I think oftentimes people may feel the costs of doing something about it are too high for them, but I do think, again, maybe naively, I do think that there is a kind of a crack you know, and that sometimes the cracks take a long time to accumulate or to play themselves out, and painfully long, right? And then also in some ways people may harbor dissident thoughts and kind of look out and say, how safe is it for me to think these thoughts or act on these thoughts, and kind of look, and then they kind of, at a certain point, becomes a little bit safer and more people are willing to say those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, the notion that like, it's very rare that we're going to see somebody encounter something and immediately in the moment
Right.
their mind shifts, but
Right.
it's like these openings.
Right, and also, I'm not saying that encountering Palestinians is the only thing that we should be pushing for, right? I mean, I also think there has to be pressure, there has to be a kind of resistance that means that life for Israeli Jews, that this system of supremacy and violence, that it stops, that the costs for Israeli Jews go up. Not costs in terms of Israeli Jews dying, but, you know, costs in terms of things that maybe Israel not being in Eurovision, or maybe Israel not being in international soccer competition, or maybe Israelis, businesses not being, or finance companies not being as competitive in the international market, or not having the same economic relations we are, or maybe even being concerned that if you fly, you know, if you go somewhere after your military service, you may have to reckon with people asking you hard questions of what you did. I mean, even that, I want to say, I don't celebrate that. And those prospects don't like fill me with glee. I really wish we lived in a world where those things were not possible, right? Where moral persuasion alone and encounter was enough, but I don't see much evidence in this case, or in other historical cases, that it is.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have pointed out that very rarely are people in a position that the oppressor is going to simply be convinced by logic or morality
Right.
that they are in the wrong.
Right.
But a sort of slight pivot, but we've been talking obviously a lot of the dynamics that we've been discussing apply really across the Jewish community, but obviously we're the halachic left, so interested in your thoughts about ways that you feel like, distinct patterns that you feel like play out particularly in the religious observant Jewish communities, ways that some of these dynamics, these narratives, these failures to acknowledge Palestinian humanity, the way that support around Israel is manufactured, ways that that either does mirror in a lot of ways on the rest of the Jewish world, or ways that it meaningfully differs.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the dynamic is that I think the Orthodox community has become the leadership of the American Jewish community in a way that it wasn't so much a generation or two, that basically like the people who want to go into these communal life and leadership is basically much more coming from the Orthodox community. I mean, I think it's transformed the nature of American Jewish organizational life. I mean, there's someone who told me this story in the just about how much things have changed. He's an Orthodox guy and now older, and he told me that in the 1970s he worked at the Anti-Defamation League. So it was winter, and he said he wanted to go home early on Friday, Shabbos, and he asked, "Can I leave early?" And they said no. And he said it was very strange because I would have called the Anti-Defamation League. So I think that's inconceivable today, right? Like there's just a sense in which there's a prestige and also just a presence of observant and Orthodox Jews with much more than there was before. And so I think that's that means that the currents that happen inside the Orthodox and observant communities, I think, resonate much more widely, and I think very disproportionate percentage of the pro-Israel campus activists on these campuses are kids who are coming out of Orthodox environments, and so I think that those environments are, on the one hand, more difficult, I think, to change than. Because I think there's a greater ideological kind of consistency and coherence in those spaces than there is in the kind of secular, progressive except Palestine place, right? Because, this is basically ethoses that are not liberal in general, right? That are not universalistic in general, in which it's not like, oh, I hate what Trump is doing to the immigrants, and I'm extremely concerned about what he's doing to the climate, and I hate his assault on abortion rights, but we've got to protect, right? Like those things are just not. This is the Orthodox community. I don't feel people is just comfortable inside the Republican Party at this point, for the most part, and on general. And I actually think that once you get on the team, you actually you absorb other things too. I mean, I remember my son, who's not here, was years ago, even at the beginning of the Trump era, he came back from camp and he said, I said, what were your political conversations like? And he said they were really. I said, well, they're really difficult. And I said, Israel thing. And he was like, no, they're anti-immigrants. You know, I'm like, really? That's the new thing? You know, it's like just the way in which that was. You know, once you're in that tent, you know, you're getting that media. That becomes so. But I think that there's tremendous, even if there's tremendous significance and importance to kind of people in this group. For partly because I think there's so many other young American Jews who are alienated from the Judaism that they were offered, but don't necessarily have the skill sets to lead a community that would be based on something else. But they might want to be part of it, but they need other people who may have greater skills to basically help to create those institutions and to teach them so they can acquire those skills. And that's why I think the percentage of people who want to participate in a non-Zionist Kabbalat Shabbat service is much, for every 10 people who want to participate, only one person can actually lead it, right? And so the person who can lead it and then help other people, I think that's really, really important. In terms of why, what it is that leads a minority of people who are in more observant and Orthodox spaces to become more critical of Israel, I mean, I think that you folks are kind of understudied sociologically, so I don't necessarily know that we have the data to
There's
really...
someone who's gathered who...
Oh, there is?
There's someone in Brandeis who did I don't know what the results are out.
Oh, good. Okay, well, I would love to...
Just doing a survey, basically.
Oh, good. So I would love to know. So, and maybe send it to me. So I guess my hypothesis might be that if there is some other aspect of your identity or your family or something that means you don't fit perfectly in this world, which has a kind of a box, and you are a little bit out in some other way, and you can see things from the outside a little bit, you have some experience of being an outsider or margin in those communities, even if you're part of them, it's more likely that that you may see this from another perspective as well. I guess that's my hypothesis, but I'm waiting till the data is in.
I do think that maps, something that I think maps onto dynamics of also just broader left moves. Like, I feel like anecdotally, a lot of the friends who are straight, cis, white men who moved left. Right. There's several for whom it was chronic illness, for example.
I've heard exactly that thing.
Where that's often a thing that can happen if none of your existing identities are one that you were marginalized by a visa. That's a thing that suddenly you realize how broken so many of the structures that you exist in are.
100%. And one of the things that really struck me when I was on campuses a lot last year in particular was, meeting Jewish students who are in the encampment and then meeting Jewish students who are afraid of the encampment was how much questions of gender identity and sexual orientation and other things, that the anti-Zionist non-Jews tended to be very disproportionately queer in some sense. And the folks that I found seemed most strongly rooted in pro-Israel politics, if they were not observant, were often the kids in fraternities or sororities, which seemed to me a lot about a radically different notion of what kind of gender norms you want. And I think it just seems to me that under the surface is a big issue that plays out on this question.
Yeah, I was at the LGBT National Convention, and I don't think I've ever been in a space that was that queer, that was not an explicitly queer space.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic when you're talking about what's getting people to move between folks growing up in these more religious communities versus not, because as you pointed out, folks who are growing up in more politically progressive communities, there's theoretically the ideological tension of having all your other commitments becoming increasingly in tension with your commitments to Israel. But also, for a lot of folks, related to what you're saying about all these people who, once they do move, want to engage Jewishly and don't have the tools to do that, for whom, commitment to Israel is pretty much the entire content of their Jewish identity. Right. Where in some ways that can be very sticky, right? If the entire premise of your Jewishness is your relationship to Israel, then if you leave that, then it sort of leaves a bit of an abyss. Whereas, interesting, I think for religious communities, on the one hand, especially if you're growing up in one that is more ideologically right across the board, if it's not for one of these other points of tension or identities, you might not ever break out. But if you start to question, I think it's deeply, I'm sure most people can talk that it's still deeply painful and isolating and difficult, but also it's not well, if I leave Zionism, I have nothing.
Absolutely. I will never forget, maybe it was a decade ago or so now, I was, believe it or not, at one point invited to speak in TNEC. It was, again, the most left-wing institution in TNEC, and even there produced, I guess, a little bit of a semi-riot. But I spoke, and it was really interesting. And then I was at this, I was there over Shabbat, and I was at this Shabbat meal, and there was a lot of talk about, you get a lot of the people's kids who were in Israel, have been in Israel, blah, blah. And some of the conversation got to, I threw out this question of like, in what way does TNEC require Israel? Could you not, because obviously these places are very connected, but and weirdly, by the end of the conversation, I think the conclusion was TNEC will be fine. In precisely a way that, as you say, that a lot of less observant communities would not, or less Jewish communities would not be, in the sense that you would be taking away the central piece, right? But I think this maybe is part of the reason for this hunger that I think halakhic left, the people in this movement can go and serve that hunger and be part of a tremendous Jewish renewal and radical change in American Jewish life. And unfortunately, this money that we have in the Jewish community is not being spent on doing this work, right? Because it would require recognizing that Jewish renewal requires accepting a future which is at least partly not Zionist. But I think that there's a real yearning and hunger for this, and it's precisely because people realize if this is taken away, they have nothing, and they don't want it to be. They don't want there to be nothing. They want actually something which is perhaps better, which is perhaps more meaningful and more ethical.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
I think we have time for maybe a few more questions between the two of you.
And then
And
we'll
I
start
just passed
collecting.
out cards and pencils. Do we also want to make this for our audience, please?
Yeah, so once people have written their questions, can also start circulating towards here.
Just give me 1 second just to run to the restroom. I'll be back in 1 second. So, sorry, brief intermission.
Yes, so people
Get
can
water,
just
you want?
write a question. And actually, what I would love to do is this. If this is a really special and unique situation where halakhic left has come together along with other people who are new to the halakhic left, if you wouldn't mind just turning to the 2 or 3 people next to you and sharing a question that you have, and a different question, and that way when it comes time to actually ask it, we can make the best use of our time. So 4-minute turn and talk. Yes, I used to be the director of education in a museum, as you can tell. So just do a 3-minute turn and talk about a question you might have right now. And raise your thing up high if you have something to want to give already. You can't get them to start talking and you can't get them to stop talking. All right, finish this way.
I think I'll ask one more question and then we can, start taking questions. Just want to get a lot of time for that. But something that I think is a really core question and tension for a lot of us here and for halakhic left in general is, we describe ourselves, like a big part of our goal as being about like shifting the conversation within religious communities. But obviously this isn't a question just for Jews, it's a question for anyone trying to make change always within a particular community or structure. But the question of like, how much are we able to move people in the existing institutions and structures that we exist in, the communities that we currently occupy? How much energy to just focus on building things that are not yoked to this framework, that are not already committed to these forms of virulent ethno-nationalism? How much those can be like a sort of combined strategy of, a friend once described it as like you this is a really interesting analogy, but I don't think it's actually very accurate. But they're like, Titanic, some people didn't even go on the rowboats, right? Like, some people actually just didn't even take them and stay where they were. What you need to do is you need to have a party boat. People want to go onto your party boat, right? Like, you have to make it appealing to jump ship, as it were. Which, the idea of, like, creating new structures as a means not only of creating something,
Yes.
for the people who are there,
Yeah.
but as a means of curative, as it were. But I'm interested in your thoughts on, like, what does effective organizing from within look like? What do you feel like, the most effective uses of our energies are? Obviously, there's no simple answer.
Yeah. I mean, I like that analogy. I mean, it's a little bit of a disturbing analogy, but I mean, I guess there was probably a time where I would have been more optimistic about changing these established mutual organizations. I think they've kind of hardened and kind of closed in on themselves more as things have shifted in the society at large. I feel like they've kind of become more fortified in their kind of bunker. But I do think that one of the things I think is I think that you kind of never, when you create these different institutions and counter these kind of counter established institutions and bring people to them, I think you don't always know exactly who may be watching and who may be noticing. And I think that I have been just interpersonal. I mean, I have several. I can think of several very prominent pro-Israel communal leaders whose children I know are in a radically different place, and those are just the ones I know. I think that there are probably many more, and I think that's a very powerful and effective thing. Those parents are noticing, and it may over time affect their behavior. And it was I think that Eugene McCarthy famously ran for president in 1968 because his children, who had become anti-war activists, told him he needed to do something. And so I think that you can have, by creating these institutions, you can have an effect on the older people that your parents or your rabbis growing up or whoever, and then also you counter some of their stereotypes and their fears about these institutions by creating them and allowing them to see them. And I think that can have a really positive effect over time.
Yeah, I think that there is something very powerful to, also you guys are sorting the questions?
Yeah, I got them.
To the combined work, right, of not cutting off
Right.
all relationship,
Yes.
because I think to the extent that we utterly sever our relationship to these institutions, it's a lot
Yes.
harder to sort of create bridges between those spaces.
Yes.
But like, maybe to not place our primary hopes in like a bunch of shuls suddenly deciding that they're going to take down their Israeli flag.
Right, and I think this is part of why I think what Halachic Left and Smolini are doing is really valuable. Like I noticed that when the Smolini had that conference, I knew quite a few people from my shul who I don't think are politically, not really on the left, but they were kind of curious and intrigued, and maybe they had some thought, and they went to kind of check it out. And I think they may not have, and I think that, again, it was really important that was there for them to look at and maybe realize that they, I just think that people have often very narrow-minded and kind of frankly condescending and inaccurate views, often about the left and including about the Jewish left, and it's valuable to give them institutions where they can actually see those things being countered.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of questions, we're sorting them. And Peter and Lexi, the questions range from everything to more personal, which is how you deal with criticism, to moving into Israel and how you might imagine a future, if there is a future, a Zionist future, and then all the way to what's happening in Iran. And so I'm going to sort these questions, but I'm going to begin with a personal, because I think that for everybody in this room who has entered into a conversation with somebody either on a campus, in a shul, in a room like this, being able to stay yourself without feeling a personal attack is something that can really wear on you a lot. And so this question says, how do you personally deal with criticism from your left, claiming that you are not supportive enough of Palestinians, so the left,
Yes.
and then how do you ensure that critiques don't weaken your resolve for Palestinian rights? So how do you deal with criticism that's coming at you from the right, not a good Jew, all the way from the left, and how do you stay strong with that? And when you answer that question, what sort of like, how can we learn from that? What can we take from this?
Absolutely. And of course, Lexi, you should feel free to, to respond as well. I think that, I actually, I think that for me, when in terms of kind of Palestinian, I would distinguish between the kind of pro-Palestinian left and Palestinian. So for me, it's important when I wrote my book, or I'm going to say something, to share it with Palestinian friends first and see how they react. And that's important to me. It may not be that I didn't. I mean, I had I think 3 different Palestinian readers of my book, and there were lots and lots of comments, and some of the comments I didn't take, partly because I felt like they would have been undermining for the Jewish audience. It wasn't necessarily, I thought even what they were saying was entirely wrong. I just felt like, if I say this, I'm going to lose everyone on page 23, like I can't say this. So it was part of that, but it was really important for me to kind of, to be humble enough to make sure that I was learning and taking seriously. So that's one thing I do. But I think that to me that's listening and is different than saying that you always have to assent. And I think to me, one of the valuable things I think about trying to have to be listening to a lot of different Palestinians and having a range of different Palestinian relations with Palestinians is it's valuable in part because it reminds you that Palestinians are not monolithic, right? I had a prominent, a Palestinian guy, came up to me recently and said, Peter, I think the Jews need to just redefine Zionism so it's consistent with equal rights. And I thought, have you run that by your Palestinian? How is that going over your, in your communal circles? But it was just, this guy, I won't go into details about who he was, but given his class position, his life experience, it led him to that he was radically different than some of the things again, he still believed the Nakba was horrible, it hurt his family, really, he believes in equal rights, but so I think part of I think the value of trying to listen to a lot of Palestinians is it makes you realize there may be certain positions that inherently are anti-Palestinian, you don't think Palestinians deserve equality, but there are a lot of other kinds of conversations in which different Palestinians have different kinds of thoughts because, of course they would, right? And so that to me is one of the things I try to remember. And then I have the right to say, this is something that feels more according to my values and my sensibility in this lens. And so I think I also find that when I've been out in the country and, not on social media, but kind of just speaking around, and there generally are a fair number of Palestinians who come to my talks, I actually don't encounter that much criticism. And again, maybe because the bar is so low, frankly. One of the things that I often find funny, is like I'll go to a place, like some city or whatever, some college town, and then it's like there are a group of different people. There are some Palestinians there, and then there's some Jews there, and then there's some random other people. And one of the things that often strikes me is that the Jews, because the Jews who decided to go have made a very self-conscious decision to be on the left. Right? Otherwise they wouldn't be there, right? But the Palestinians who are there are just Palestinians, right? It's not necessarily that being on the left is their identity. They have no choice, they're Palestinians, right? And so I'm someone who's actually, I find that they strike me as someone who's less leftist and sometimes than the Jews or the non-Jews, right? And that if they weren't Palestinian, they might actually be, so in terms of the stuff on the right, I would just say I've experienced, and I'm very grateful, a tremendous amount of generosity and kindness and appreciation, even for people who would have every right to say, why are you, writing the New York Times and getting to express yourself when we still have so little representation and you came to this so late? And I think, I try to use that unearned privilege I have to try to make changes. So I spend a fair amount of time talking to editors and bookers and other people I know who invite me to do things to say, well, have you thought about asking this person? Have you thought about the fact that Palestinians aren't in this conversation? In terms of the Jewish criticism, I would say, for me, it makes a big difference if it's someone who I have a relationship with and someone who I don't know. If someone I don't know, I'm generally just going to be inclined to ignore, unless I think it is a very thoughtful and well thought out criticism. If it's just basically like some diatribe and vitriol, like, what's the point? You know, like, I've got, there are only 24 hours in a day, I have lots of things to do. This person is not, it's not useful to me. If it is someone who I have a relationship with, I would say I kind of have one of two strategies. The first is that if this person is open to us not discussing this issue and having a relationship and putting this issue aside, that is fine for me. I'm totally okay with that. I mean, maybe it's morally maybe it's not totally morally defensible, but I feel like I have a lot of time in my day. I have the luxury of being able to spend a lot of time trying to put out my ideas in the world. I don't need to do it with this particular person, given that I'm very likely it's just going to wreck our relationship and it's not going to have much of an impact. So I think that, to me, is one of my closest friends. We have this understanding. As far as I know, he's never read any. I mean, I see him constantly. We talk constantly, and I'm at his house very frequently. And I don't think he claims to have never read anything else. And thank goodness. I think if it's people who do want to engage on the subject, and they're people who matter to me, I try to do it not in an electronic form. I kind of will get an email or a text or something. I'll kind of go, okay, something maybe that wasn't so pleasant to get. And then I'll say, well, why don't we take a walk on Saturday at 3:30 in the afternoon or something like that. And that tends to go better. Now I will say even that's become harder after October 7th, than it was before. But I feel like that to me is I just find the electronic back and forth just there's something about electronic interaction. I mean, this is nothing like particularly profound to me. It's just like it just escalates, and then you just end up feeling debilitated and someone finally just is exhausted and stops. Whereas I feel like when you have a conversation and you're looking the person in the eye, I think people interact with each other in a different way.
Picking up on this idea of multiple perspectives.
Can I say one more thing? I also try to remember not to be too judgmental of people who have views that I don't like, A, because my own views have shifted, and secondly, because people's character is not people's views on this particular subject is not the sum total of their ethical character, right? I mean, the truth is, most people, the most important thing that they do that they'll probably be judged on by Hashem are how they treat the people closest to them, right? And I know lots of people who I think their views on this are really, really, really bad, but it's also a fairly abstract issue for them, and I see the way they behave in their actual life. And I think they're really, really good people in many, many ways, and that I have a lot to learn from. And then conversely, I see people who have really, really terrific views in the abstract and are kind of assholes to the people around them. So I just try to remember not to be too self-righteous just because I don't like someone's beliefs. I'm sorry about that.
No, I'm just like making a note to myself, don't be too self-righteous. I don't know if I can do that. But picking up on this idea of multiple perspectives, we have the next two questions are going to take us in different directions. One of them is thinking about tachlis, like what we can do right now as educators and in classrooms. And the other one is in really thinking about the fact that there's a pervasiveness of documentation about horrors in Gaza and that people are turning away from. So going to the first question, one of the things that I know as a parent, and I've talked to you about this before, I am incredibly concerned about is the fact that there's a new generation of young students, especially in our Jewish day schools, that are coming up with a very specific binary perspective of good and bad. And so this question speaks specifically to that and says, as a Sunday school teacher, how can I teach this topic in a way that is respectful to the shul without scaring kids, but also holding fast to my morals? And I think, Peter and Lexi, as you're both also educators in the roles that you take on, this is an increasingly important question of how do we be the person we want to be and teach this next generation how to be better and do better, but also understanding that the institution we're in might not be so supportive of that. 3 seconds or less.
Again, feel free, Lexi. I mean, I guess I would say, I think one wants to try to push the institution as much as one can, but then if one hits a wall, one obviously has to make the decision about what one's alternative to that institution is, whether it's the place you send your kids or the place you work, and I can't make that decision for other people. Everyone has their own decisions to make, and everybody kind of makes compromises of some form or another. I mean, but I also think then maybe one has the opportunity to do things outside of the institution. So I think that, it may be that your synagogue or your school is not willing to curate these conversations, but there may be a minority of people at that institution who are. You just have to do it outside of that institution. And that's where I think that, why I think, what I think, my friend Esther Sperber has been doing has been really great. I mean, I think that she knows that, SAR, where she sends her kids, are not going to have these. But she knows that there are some parents at SAR who would, in that kind of institution, who would go if you create it for them, right? And so I think that's a good, it's probably more useful for her to do that than to keep beating her head against the wall at an institution which at this moment in time is just not going to do it itself.
So what I heard you say is keep beating your head against the wall. Great, that's fascinating. But we might want to come back to that, but then to go into sort of the next question, which says, and I'm going to sort of ad-lib this a little bit, but I can appreciate how Zionists find ways to not see what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza. However, I struggle to understand how they can learn that American doctors working in hospitals are seeing evidence of children being shot in the head. Add that to members of the IDF posting videos on social media. And so basically this question is very directly saying, like, we have irrefutable evidence in front of us.
Yes.
That like really horrible things
Yes.
are happening
Yes.
that have been perpetrated by Jews.
Yes.
Connecting that back to this question though of
Yes.
thinking about how we teach. There's documentation, and so
Absolutely.
how are we able? And I know that you are so kind to the people you're in conversation with, which is something to learn from. But how is it possible to have this evidence in hand and be able to have conversations with people and to know that we are educators to think about students? How can we bridge that?
Yeah, I mean, it is, as you say, it is astonishing that, I mean, I hear people saying, I don't know, I hear people say things that are just so demonstrably untrue, like, Israel doesn't target civilians. Hamas targets civilians, Israel doesn't target civilians. They denied any aid, any food into Gaza for more than 2 months. And the position is to expel everybody. So what do you mean you're not targeting civilians, right? Like, I had a conversation, I interviewed a doctor a couple weeks ago who talked about basically how he was in Gaza and every day they had children who came in who had been shot in the head. The person said, I mentioned this to someone and the person said to me, well, how did that doctor know that they were killed by Israel? I said, well, the parents said that, but so it's frustrating, but I think it's just perhaps it's worth remembering that this is a human capacity that human beings have in multiple different, it's not unique to Jews or Israel Palestine. I mean, I think of as a man about the Me Too movement and about the pervasiveness of sexual harassment and sexual violence in workplaces, where it wasn't that you were looking on Instagram, but you were literally, so many men were basically in institutions where women knew that sexual harassment was taking place, and the men who were not the sexual harassers themselves, the sexual perpetrators, basically just didn't know because they didn't want to know and they didn't have to know, and so and it had a different kind of proximity. It wouldn't have been hard for them to know, but we didn't know, and so again, I just think that the human beings have a tremendous capacity to block things out. I mean, how many people walk down the street in New York City and see people lying on the street in evident agony or suffering, and basically don't see it? Myself, I mean, you see it, but you don't see it.
I also relate to what you talked about when it comes to the narratives that we're telling, because also if you're in a narrative in which, again, like fundamentally, Israel, both like obviously there's sort of contradiction of Israel in a position of strength, but also as eternal like victim, but one in which like fundamentally everything is justifiable within the meta narrative. Like for a lot of people, the fact is like the immediate thing that is triggered in your brain when you see a horrible picture, even if you register it at all, is like, that's so terrible and Hamas made them do it.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Like that's the refrain is like, if they only gave the hostages back, this wouldn't be happening.
Right. Yes, exactly right. Ultimately, yeah, they guard the Hamas.
I'm going to read this one because this is really thinking about sort of our role and how we exist within communities. And I think we're going to have about time for like 2 or 3 more questions, and then we can schmooze it and do more of that. In recent debates, thinkers like you, Gideon Levy, and others have been accused of being on the fringes of the Jewish community. Is there a way of using Jewish tradition, and then somebody else also wrote about texts, like halachic texts, so I'm going to throw that in as well. Is there a way of using Jewish tradition, Jewish texts, to emphasize the value of existing in the margins?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think so, and I think that, yeah, I mean, I struggle with this too. I did this interview, I did a, may not have been the wisest decision, but I did a public kind of conversation with Shai Davide. And it kind of went south very quickly. But one of the interesting things was, the first thing he said was, it's fundamentally dishonest to have me with Peter because there should be 9 of me and 1 of him. Because my view is normative and his view is extremely marginal. And at that moment, I really was struggling to figure out how much to argue back and to say, no, there probably should be like 3.5 of me, or whatever in the United States. Maybe in maybe in Canada, maybe only 2. But to say like, who gives a shit, right? I mean, like, the truth and moral correctness of a position is not based on how many people share that view. And then we can think of many examples of positions that were considered marginal at one point in time that now are kind of considered obvious morally. So I think that there is a value to that, and I think that, again, one of the things that I think is so fabulous and inspiring about Halakha Left is the work of bringing these texts into the conversation. And I think I particularly appreciate it because I think Halakha Left does not fall into the pitfall of saying, the essence of Judaism is basically that if you study Torah and Talmud, basically you end up with a Bernie Sanders, platform, right? I mean, that it's recognized that these texts are open to multiple interpretations, and I think, again, maybe disagree, that ultimately, if one's really honest, one has to acknowledge that one brings one's own priors to these texts, that there is no kind of blank slate that you come to the text with. You come to the text with a pre-existing set of things that you're more inclined to find compelling for whatever reasons, and then those are the things that you tend to emphasize. And but I think that if one does that and is honest about it, then I think one is a part of a process of interpretation which is incredibly valuable and can give people to an appreciation of the beauty and excitement of engaging with those texts, who might not have had that experience. I mean, one thing, on the question of mortality, I think that I think about this, there's, Moshe is kind of seeing the overseer strike the Jewish slave, and then he kind of looks to his right and looks to his left and sees nobody's there, and then, so the rabbi say, and it's problematically gendered, of course, but in the place where there is no man, be a man, right? In the place where there is not humanity, bring humanity, right? And so that is a statement about marginality. It's a statement about being willing to be the nachshon, right? To kind of take that view when it's not being widely held. And I'm really deeply inspired by people who are willing to do that and people who are willing to suffer a lot. And there are, unfortunately, because previous generations of American Jews who did that are often kind of cast aside and marginalized. Sometimes I think we're not always aware of the previous generations of people who did that. I'm planning on going in the next couple weeks to visit a man named Henry Siegman, who I would really encourage you, if you get a moment, just to look up online. I mean, Henry Siegman's father was an Orthodox rabbi in Germany, family on the run from the Nazis, managed to escape under extraordinary circumstances in the United States, was a student of Soloveitchik, was the head of the Central Conference of Rabbis, and was a very prominent mainstream Orthodox rabbi and Jewish leader who, in the 1980s, began to have very dissident thoughts and met with Arafat and started to write and basically lost his job at the Council on Foreign Relations, lost his job in the Jewish institutional world, and is really to my mind of kind of like there have always been these people who are willing to stand out and kind of stand alone. And I think unfortunately like they often don't get the kavod that they deserve. And one of the things that I think it's important for people like you to remind yourself that you are in the footsteps of these people, and it's also really, really important for them to know about you, because in some ways, like, I think you are in some ways the fruit of the work of people who did things when they didn't have something like a halakha left, which made it all the more difficult, all the more difficult and all the more remarkable.
Yeah, there's a similar, I mean, on the theme of Yetziat Mitzrayim, there's like a text, I would say, about marginality or minority that I've found simultaneously both really moving and really disturbing since I first encountered it, which people may have, well, actually no, this is a different version of the kind of numbers games we get in the Seder, but it's a midrash on the pasuk in Beshalach where it says that Bnei Israel, like, alu chamushim, that they came out, again, the shot of that word is they emerged armed from Egypt, but the rabbis play on the letters of Chamesh, and they say 1 in 5 Israelites left Egypt. And then another rabbi says actually 1 in 50 Israelites left Egypt. Another one says 1 in 500 Israelites left Egypt. And that the rest of them were like actually, despite all of the suffering and subjugation, so steeped in like the norms and idolatry of Egypt that fundamentally they aligned with their oppressor, and that they were killed during the Makot Choshech. And it's like a really, again, I find like both chizuk and horror in that, because I think it's like simultaneously this notion that like this foundational story that we were taught is like the creation of the Jewish people is actually one of intense minority, that this like tiny fraction of who we understand as Bnei Israel were actually the ones who left and actually the ones who became Bnei Israel. And obviously that's clearly, the rabbis who are writing this are presumably articulating their own sense of like marginality, like they're not the majority of their society, and yet also the Judaism they created became the Judaism that is like normative for us. And also like the notion of like, I don't like the notion of leaving behind 4 out of 5 or 49 out of 50 or 499 out of 500 Jews. So like, the challenge of finding both some measure of like support in that vision, and also that is like maybe not an ideal model of how we progress.
It's amazing, and it's even more amazing when one thinks about the fact that some of the people who do leave are the Erev Rav, right, who are not Jews, and that even the Jews who do leave, that minority almost immediately want to go back, right? So anyway, I love how subversive that whole story is.
Carolyn's going to talk more about this in a minute, but to keep, like, there's going to be many opportunities for people here to keep talking about precisely this. Just write on your calendar July 20th. But I want to end like this general conversation with my favorite type of a question, which, quote, hyper-specific question. I love a hyper-specific question. So we're going to end with this, but I encourage you to stay talking, have conversations, because there were so many more that we couldn't get to. And this one says, when I argue about Israel with my sister, she always uses the unilateral disengagement from Gaza as evidence that Palestinian self-governance isn't realistic, and I never know how to respond. What would you say? So let's we're gonna end like such tachlis.
Right.
Like, give us talking points.
Yeah, okay. I have written about this a bit. I mean, I think that the first thing to say is that Ariel Sharon's decision to bring to withdraw Israeli soldiers and settlers from Gaza was not, I think, understood by academics as an effort to move towards a Palestinian state. It was actually W. Weissglass, as chief of staff, famously said it would be like formaldehyde. It would freeze the peace process. He's under pressure from the Arab Peace Initiative and also from the Geneva Accord of groups of former negotiators who would come to an agreement to basically continue on with the negotiating process that Barak had been involved in. He didn't want to do that, right? So he felt like this would forestall that. So I think that's one thing in terms of the intention. The second thing is that Israel did not end its occupation of Gaza. Israel changed the form of its occupation of Gaza. It's like a prison where you don't have prison guards inside, but you have them erected outside. Israel had been actually separating off Gaza from the West Bank even starting in the First Intifada, but it becomes much more severe after 2005, and so even like this, people talk about the greenhouses, right? Or the greenhouses. We gave them these greenhouses. If you look at Jim Wolfenson, who was the head of the World Bank, Jewish Australian, who was in charge of the greenhouse effect, he says that the reason the greenhouse efforts failed there was some attacks on the greenhouses initially, but basically that wasn't very significant. It was they couldn't export, basically. The restrictions that Israel had on the exports of agriculture were so severe that basically these flowers, tomatoes, or whatever, basically just withered, basically. Well, so, and then there's the question of how Israel, of the 2006 election, right? You know, and I'm trying to, you know, the first thing to remember about that election was that it wasn't just held in Gaza. It was held in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. So a lot of people say it's okay to kill the people in Gaza now because they voted for Hamas, right? Well, actually, then it's also okay to kill the people, the Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The Palestinians hadn't had an election in 10 years, right? They hadn't had an election since 1996. The PA was, Fatah was considered corrupt. My friend Mohammed Shahad always tells the story of growing up in Gaza and how the Hamas leader, local candidate, came around in his beat-up car and said, "You see what cars they're driving?" He basically says, "I'm driving a beat-up car, and I promise you I will still be driving a beat-up car after you elect me." That Hamas had this reputation for providing social services, for not being corrupt. They were the alternative. And just like Israelis voted for Netanyahu as the alternative when they got disillusioned, right? Palestinians moved to vote for this alternative. The Khalil Shakaki's exit polling showed that 60% of Hamas voters in 2006 said they supported the two-state solution, and that the number 1 and 2 issues that, in the election were corruption and lack of law and order, right? And so then Hamas wins a plurality. Hamas wins a plurality of the vote and a majority of the seats, because Fatah runs 2 candidates in these single districts, splitting the Fatah vote. And then the American Israel's decision is to give Hamas a series of conditions which are impossible for Hamas to meet, which even the Israeli government could not meet, including abiding by, you know, Hamas's whole idea was, we're not going to concede the recognition of Israel until we have at least a promise of a Palestinian state, or we're basically not going to be friars like Fatah was, who basically gave away this trump card of recognition without getting a promise of a Palestinian state and without even getting an end to settlement vote. We're going to drive a harder bargain, which is kind of in some ways what Netanyahu was saying on the other side. Mm-hmm. And so what you could have done to Hamas is said, fine, you don't recognize Israel now. Here's what we're saying to you. Mahmoud Abbas is still the president. He's going to negotiate. If he reaches an agreement with Israel, there will be a referendum among Palestinians. Do you commit to respect the will of the Palestinian people in a referendum if they vote for 2 states? That would have been something Hamas could have accepted. And then you could have negotiated a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas while this negotiation process was happening. Instead, what happened is that the United States and Israel basically armed Mohammed Dahlan, who was a warlord in Gaza, particularly hated because he had been involved in torturing of Hamas prisoners on Fatah, and basically gave them a bunch of guns and said, go in and overthrow them. And then they lost, and Hamas won that battle, and then Hamas took control. Anyway, it's a long answer. There's probably a shorter version of this, but I think, as in many areas, the narrative that we have doesn't really actually, I think, do really any real justice to what actually happened in these events.
Thank you. I think we're all in agreement that you're going to come back for part 2, right? Like tomorrow.
Absolutely.
What do you all do tomorrow? Okay.
My pleasure.
Amazing. And so Carolyn is going to tell us about what's next.
Yes.
And I just want to say one more thing, which is that we said before about Shai Davidai. There are a bunch of us here that are Columbia, and we don't want 1 of him, let alone 9 of him. And so let's just say no to that automatically. Okay. So
Shai
you
Davidai's
can-
in building
every issue.
So like
Shai
when knocking
Davidai.
his door, he'll probably call the police.
But what I want to say is that we have organized this event this evening, that there's time afterwards for you to stay and talk to each other for at least a few more minutes, just to make sure that you make connections, you have conversations, and that we find physical with each other. Okay, Karen.
Yes, so thank you all for coming out. I just want to make a few announcements. First is that if you want to sign up for our email list, if you are somehow not on our email list, you can do so at a sign-up sheet in the back. We also have some upcoming events. One in particular is the Halachic Left Forum, presenting works on nationalism, community, and boundaries, which is on Sunday, July 20th, here in on the Upper West Side at Beinart, and it's $25. If that is an issue for you, please talk to me. But it will basically be kind of an academic style conference, presenting papers, both Shuvot and more kind of Jewish thought articles on various topics such as Baltash Faith and the Laws of War, Halacha and Democracy, and Lexi has a paper that she is presenting on kashrut and Palestinian solidarity spaces. For the full list of topics, you can, I mean, we advertise it, we will share more on email. Yeah, on the registration form there's a full list of the topics and the kind of rough schedule of the day. But yeah, it's all day on Sunday, July 20th. Would love to see everyone here. And so in the back we have cupcakes.
Why?
I think there's definitely enough for everyone to have one. The reason that we have cupcakes is that, so for those of you who aren't aware, Halachic Left kind of started as a WhatsApp group almost 18 months ago. Actually, an event we had on the Upper West Side with Peter, but about 5.5 months later, we decided that we wanted to be a real organization. And so the date that our articles of incorporation were filed with the state of New York is actually tomorrow. That is when we became a corporation, so it's the birthday of the corporate person that is left. So we have cupcakes. Kashrut information, unfortunately they're parv, I'm sorry, they didn't have any dairy cupcakes. I apologize for not saying this earlier, all of the food is from Kosher Marketplace, which is under Kuf K and Rabbi Avram Marmerstein. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
So big
Enjoy.
round of applause. Solving all of the world's problems. We really appreciate it. If you could just keep going, that would be really helpful. Stay, schmooze, have a cupcake. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you.
That's great, thank you, really, really enjoyed it.